Welcome in, everyone. If you're joining us today, I actually want to talk directly to you for just a second.
Yeah, right off the bat.
Right. Because we know you are here because you love learning, but you probably don't have, 40 hours this week to read through stacks of academic papers and ancient historical
Well,
analyses.
who has the time for that, really?
Exactly. You want to get straight to the core of a topic, rapidly but thoroughly, without just completely drowning in information overload. You want those real, aha moments.
Yeah.
And that is exactly what we have curated for you today.
It really is the perfect mindset for this deep dive because the material we are unpacking today operates on so many multiple levels. I mean, it is historical, it is psychological, and it is just deeply relevant to how we structure our lives today.
Okay, so usually when we look at a massive skyscraper or some sprawling corporate headquarters, there's this immediate sense of awe. Right.
Oh, sure. Yeah, you just stare at it.
You look up at all that glass and steel, the sheer engineering of the thing,
Oh.
and we think about human potential. It feels like this giant monument to progress.
Right, it feels victorious.
But imagine standing in front of the tallest, most impressive building you have ever seen in your life. You are entirely mesmerized by it.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
And then an architect taps you on the shoulder
Yeah.
and says, hey, look closer at the foundation. It is built on sand.
Oh, wow.
And the people inside, they aren't celebrating. They're actually terrified.
That completely changes the picture.
Right. Suddenly, that awe turns into a completely different kind of realization. Because you aren't looking at a monument to progress anymore. You are looking at a monument to panic.
A monument to panic. That image actually captures the exact structural illusion that we are exploring today. You see the coordination and the ambition from the outside, but the internal reality
Is driven by fear.
exactly, driven entirely by fear.
And that illusion is the absolute core of our source material today. We are looking at a story you might think you already know, which is the Tower of Babel.
But we are throwing out the Sunday school version here.
Totally throwing it out. This isn't just some ancient architectural failure. We are pulling from a really fascinating piece of research by Chris R. Velasquez. It is titled Human Pride at Babel.
Right, along with several really detailed visual breakdowns of the text that accompanied his work.
Yeah. And Velasquez takes a very distinct approach here, doesn't he?
He really does. He does not treat this text as, just a quirky historical anecdote about ancient geography, or even just the origins of different languages.
Right, which is how it's usually taught.
Exactly. In his framework, the story of Babel is actually a profound theological diagnosis of the human condition.
A diagnosis.
Yeah. He argues that the text exposes what humanity tends to do when it rejects a dependent relationship with the divine. Like, it immediately tries to manufacture its own significance.
So our mission today with this deep dive is to uncover how the bricks of Babel are literally still being laid right now.
Oh, absolutely. They are everywhere.
We aren't just talking about ancient Mesopotamia. We are going to look at how this ancient text maps onto modern empires, corporate monopolies, and our current cultural obsession with personal branding.
And what Velasquez calls the quiet interior architecture of self-glory.
The interior architecture. I love that phrase so much. So if you have ever felt that exhausting, relentless need to prove your worth or to build your own little empire just to feel safe, this deep dive is going to fundamentally reframe a lot of things for you.
To set the baseline for how we approach this, Velasquez establishes early on that Babel isn't meant to be read just as an isolated historical event.
Right. It's a pattern.
Exactly. It is presented as a recurring human pattern. According to the source, the narrative demonstrates that when people are no longer content to live dependently, they attempt to build upward what they have no right or ability to secure inwardly.
So it is an attempt to establish meaning and security as personal achievements.
Yes, rather than receiving them as given realities.
Okay, let us unpack the people who actually built this thing. Because to really understand the tower, we have to understand the trauma and the environment of the builders themselves. Let us set the scene of the crime.
Right. Let's look at the timeline.
We are looking at Genesis chapter 11.
Mm-hmm.
But to give you the immediate context and the timeline of the text, this occurs relatively soon after the global flood, which is detailed back in Genesis 9.
And that timing is critical to the psychology of the text. I mean, the flood narrative describes this cataclysmic judgment, right? But it concludes with a covenant of preservation.
The rainbow, the promise.
Exactly. The story states that God spared humanity and promised never to destroy the earth in that way again. But and this is key, Velazquez highlights a very sobering theological point within the text here.
Which is what?
While the earth was washed clean of violence physically, the human heart was not actually cured of its fundamental orientation toward rebellion.
Wow. So it is a physical reset, but totally not a psychological or spiritual one.
Not at all.
The text actually notes that the inclination of the human heart was still corrupted.
Which perfectly sets up the tension for what happens next. Following the flood, the text says God gave a very clear, very specific mandate to humanity.
Right.
It is a repetition of the original command given in the Eden narrative, which is, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth.
Fill the earth,
Be
meaning
strong.
spread out.
Yes. The divine directive was for humanity to spread out, to explore, and to basically cultivate the globe as stewards.
But then we hit Genesis 11, and the scene opens with a very different picture. The text says, now the whole earth had one language and the same words.
Right.
Now, my first instinct when reading that is to think, well, that sounds incredibly efficient. Like a shared language is a good thing, right?
I would think so, yeah.
And Velazquez makes a point to clarify that this uniformity wasn't inherently evil, does he?
He is very careful to make that distinction. According to this framework, communication, cooperation, and unity are fundamentally positive traits. They are good things. The capacity to collaborate is seen as a gift. The issue at Babel, as Velazquez argues, is not the plurality of people or their ability to speak the same language. The problem is the direction and the intent of their collaboration.
Oh, I see.
Their shared language becomes a tool that is entirely weaponized towards self-assertion.
Okay, let's unpack this, because Velazquez breaks down their true intent by isolating 3 core phrases from Genesis 11, verse 4. He calls these the 3 motives of human pride.
Right. Let's look at the first one.
The builders say to one another, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower. What is the underlying mechanism of pride there? I mean, building things is normal.
Right, but the author identifies that phrase, let us build ourselves, as the absolute essence of autonomous self-reliance.
Autonomous self-reliance.
Okay, because if you look at the mechanics of what they are doing, they aren't looking upward for direction.
Right, they aren't asking God what to do.
Exactly, and they aren't looking outward to fill the earth like they were commanded to. They are looking inward at their own hands and their own materials.
At what they can control.
Yes. The text specifically mentions they use baked bricks and bitumen, which, by the way, was highly advanced technology for Mesopotamia at the time.
Oh, interesting. So they're flexing their tech.
They are. They are essentially saying, we have the industrial capacity, we have the raw materials, and we have the engineering. We do not need divine providence to secure our future.
Wow. They are replacing dependence on God with dependence on their own technology.
Exactly.
Which leads right into the second motive that Velazquez identifies, which is self-exaltation. They follow up by saying, and let us make a name for ourselves.
And this is where the psychological diagnosis goes so much deeper. This isn't just about survival anymore. This is a hunger for glory.
For legacy.
Right. Velazquez argues that this represents the desire to possess an identity and a legacy that is entirely self-generated. They want to be the center of their own universe.
They want the credit.
Exactly. In the theological framework of the text, seeking the ultimate glory that belongs to the Creator is the very definition of idolatry. They want permanence and honor, but they want to achieve it entirely on their own terms.
And that ties perfectly into the third motive, which I actually think reveals the real fear driving this whole project, self-protection.
Right.
Because they state their reason for building the tower is, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth.
That phrase right there is the smoking gun of their rebellion.
Because it goes right against the mandate.
Exactly. Remember the initial mandate we discussed? Fill the earth. God had spoken dispersal as their primary vocation, but the builders look at that expansive outward-facing vocation, and their reaction is terror.
It's too vulnerable for them.
They fear the vulnerability of creaturely dependence, so they choose centralization as their security blanket. They are actively, consciously resisting the divine command.
I want to stop on that concept of centralization for a second, because it instantly makes me think of how modern corporate monopolies operate.
Oh, that is a great comparison.
Right. Or even think of a massive, hyper-powerful tech hub. Think about the mechanics of a monopoly. You have all this incredible talent, these brilliant engineers, and massive capital.
Just concentrated in one spot.
Exactly. And the healthiest thing for an economy is for that talent and capital to spread out, to decentralize and cross-pollinate new ideas across the globe, right?
But that requires releasing control. which they won't do.
Exactly. Or rather, that requires trusting the broader ecosystem. But what does the monopoly do? It hoards.
It pulls everything inward.
It pulls all the top talent, all the patents, and all the wealth into one centralized location. They build these massive, insular, multi-billion-dollar campuses that are practically their own city-states.
Like their own little Babels?
Literally. And they do it because the executives are terrified of losing control of the market. They want to concentrate power to create permanence. But by hoarding that capacity, they actually stagnate the broader ecosystem because they are terrified of what might happen if they disperse their influence.
That analogy maps perfectly onto Velazquez's analysis of the Babel impulse. A monopoly's primary goal often shifts from creating value to just protecting its own dominance.
Right.
And the builders of Babel are doing the exact same thing on a societal level. It is the hoarding of human capacity for the sake of control. The source material notes that they want ascension without submission.
Ascension without submission.
Yes, they want the stature of reaching heaven, but they flat out refuse to embrace the vulnerability of trusting the divine plan.
So if they have all this talent concentrated in one place, what do they actually build? The famous tower.
The tower itself, yes.
Genesis describes it as a tower with its top in the heavens. But looking at the historical context provided in our sources, they weren't literally trying to build a physical staircase into the clouds to invade heaven, were they?
No, it is highly unlikely they thought they were literally going to breach the physical atmosphere to reach the gods.
That sounds more like a cartoon.
Right. Archaeologically speaking, scholars generally agree we are looking at something like a ziggurat.
A ziggurat.
Yes, a ziggurat was a massive terraced step pyramid that was very common in ancient Mesopotamia. These structures weren't just tall buildings, they were the focal point of a city's political and religious prestige.
So building, it wasn't about transportation like an elevator to heaven, it was about making a statement.
They were deeply, deeply symbolic monuments. In the ancient Near Eastern mindset, the ziggurat represented a meeting place between heaven and earth.
Okay.
Vivelis explains that by building this, they were erecting a monument to their own transcendence. It was their way of institutionalizing their pride.
Institutionalized pride.
It was this massive civic project that consolidated their political, cultural, and spiritual rebellion into one highly visible structure.
And with humanity completely unified in this massive defiant project, the stage is set for what Vivelis calls one of the greatest literary and theological ironies in history.
It really is brilliant writing.
Because think about the narrative pacing here. The builders are sweating, they are mass-producing these advanced bricks, they're incredibly proud of this massive ziggurat that they boast is scraping the heavens.
I think they're titans.
And then we hit Genesis 11, verse 5.
And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built.
The irony in the phrasing there is just devastating.
That's almost comedic.
It is. The builders think they have reached the absolute peak of cosmic significance. But their greatest engineering feat, like the pinnacle of unified human capacity, is so microscopically tiny from a divine perspective that God literally has to come down just to inspect it.
To even see it. Velazquez points out that the text is not necessarily mocking their engineering skills, though. I mean, the ancient writers knew that making bricks and building cities required immense intelligence.
It was hard work.
Very hard. What the text is exposing is the absurdity of their arrogance. It serves as this narrative reminder that the most grandiose human project, the absolute zenith of our self-exaltation, remains fundamentally minuscule before the Creator.
But God's reaction to this isn't just to laugh at their tiny building and walk away.
No, the tone shifts dramatically.
It gets very serious.
Yeah.
God observes their unified effort and says, this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them.
Right.
And Velazquez emphasizes in his notes that this statement is absolutely not a compliment.
No, the author frames this as a judicial observation by God. It is a profound recognition of the terrifying potential of sin when it is combined with unified human power.
Okay, I want to push back on this a little bit on behalf of the listener, because this is where the modern mindset really clashes with this ancient text.
Sure, let's get into it.
From kindergarten onward, we are basically taught that human cooperation is the ultimate good.
Right.
If everyone just puts aside their differences and works together, we can solve any problem.
Teamwork makes the dream work.
Exactly. Teamwork makes the dream work. So why is God looking at their total unity and seeing it as an existential threat?
To understand that, Velazquez asks us to look at the actual mechanics of unity in a fallen world. The key variable here is the moral state of the builders.
Okay.
When humanity unifies around a corrupted or idolatrous goal, their collective capacity doesn't neutralize the corruption. It actually intensifies it.
Wait, how does that work mechanically? How does unity intensify corruption?
Think about the psychology of a massive echo chamber, or like groupthink.
Oh, like on social media.
Exactly like that. When a massive group of people are all aligned in a flawed ideology, they validate each other's worst impulses. There are no dissenting voices left to apply the brakes.
Everyone is just cheering each other on.
Yes, and Velasquez spells this out so clearly. He says communal cohesion without a foundation of truth inevitably becomes mass idolatry. If the collective heart is oriented toward rebellion against God, then achieving total unity just means you have achieved totalized rebellion.
That makes a lot of sense when you put it like that. If you have 10 people making bad decisions, you just have a mess.
Yeah.
But if you have 10 million people efficiently organized to make bad decisions, you have a catastrophe.
A historical catastrophe, exactly. A society can be incredibly advanced in its technology, highly coordinated in its social systems, and massively powerful economically, and yet be completely morally disordered.
Which is terrifying.
Babel is presented as the prototype of this phenomenon. It is a unified culture that is technically impressive, but spiritually terminal.
Because progress without a moral compass is essentially just building a highly efficient engine to drive yourself off a cliff.
That's a great way to put it, which is why the intervention is necessary. When collective energy is entirely detached from reverence for the creator, civilization basically becomes an end unto itself. It becomes focused entirely on preserving its own power rather than honoring what is actually true.
So the situation demands intervention. Unchecked human unity under sin is acting as a massive amplifier for evil, and so God steps in. But the way the text describes this intervention is something that I think modern readers often completely misunderstand.
Oh, it's very frequently read purely as a punitive, angry strike. You know, the common perception is that God feels threatened, comes down, and just breaks their toys to show them who is boss.
Right, like a petty tyrant. But Velasquez frames this in a completely different light. He calls it a hard mercy.
Hard mercy, yes.
God doesn't destroy humanity with another flood. He confuses their language and disperses them over the face of the earth. He restrains them.
This brings up a fascinating philosophical point about how we view limitations in general. The confusion of languages is certainly a judgment, in the sense that it frustrates and halts their prideful project.
Right, it stops the building.
But Velasquez argues that it is simultaneously an act of profound mercy. By fracturing their communication, God is limiting the escalation of their own self-destruction. He simply will not permit fallen humanity to consolidate unlimited power around a false idolatrous center.
Because if they did achieve total unchecked power while being morally corrupt, they would essentially create hell on earth.
Precisely. The limitation restrains the reach of evil. Now, Velasquez calls it a hard mercy because, let's face it, human beings naturally despise boundaries.
We hate being told no.
We hate having our ambitions thwarted. But the theological takeaway from Babel is that sometimes the most severe disruptions to our plans are actually expressions of divine protection.
Let me throw an analogy at you to see if this captures the mechanics of that hard mercy.
Go for it.
Imagine a parent looking out into the backyard and seeing their kids building a massive 3-story treehouse.
Okay, a big project.
Right. But the kids are using rotten wood, they are using stolen rusty nails, and they are building it on branches that are completely dead.
Oh no. Okay, I see where you're going with this.
To the kids who have spent weeks on this project, height equals success. They are so proud of how tall it is.
They think it's a masterpiece.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the parent understands physics, gravity, and structural load. The parent knows that if they let the kids finish the 3rd story, the entire thing is going to collapse and severely injure them.
Worse.
Right. So the parent steps in and tears the treehouse down. Now, to the kids, that feels like an unfair, arbitrary punishment. They are crying because their masterpiece is ruined.
It feels like an attack.
But to the parent, who understands the reality of the situation, destroying the tower is a necessary intervention to literally save their lives. God blocking the path at Babel is exactly like that parent. He is preserving humanity from the ruin of their own structurally unsound ambition.
That analogy beautifully captures the disconnect between human perception and divine intention. The builders only see their ambition. God sees the inevitable collapse.
Right.
And the visual guides provided in our source material actually draw a really sharp contrast here to illustrate this. They set up a dichotomy between Babel's way and God's way.
I would love to run through those contrasts, actually, because they take this abstract theological concept and make it incredibly practical.
Well, according to the breakdown, Babel's way seeks to centralize power. God's way, as seen in the mandate to fill the earth, distributes purpose.
Distributes purpose.
Okay. Babel operates entirely out of a fear of scattering and losing control. God commands humanity to obey and go outward, trusting the outcome to him.
So fear versus trust.
Exactly. Babel places its ultimate trust in human strength and coordination. God requires trust in his provision. And finally, Babel is obsessed with building for temporary glory, while the biblical narrative argues that God is establishing an eternal kingdom.
It really just boils down to the difference between frantically trying to hoard your life to protect it versus being willing to spend your life for a greater purpose.
Yes.
But here's a question. The physical scattering and the confusion of the languages, that stops the physical construction of the ziggurat, right?
Building halts. Yes.
But what about the core sin? Like that deep psychological desire to make a name for ourselves, that doesn't magically disappear just because they can't conjugate verbs together anymore?
You have hit on the exact crux of the issue. The physical dispersion is a restraint, but it isn't a cure. The internal desire requires a much deeper spiritual remedy.
Because the heart is still the same.
Exactly. And this is where Velazquez really dives into the theology of pride. He argues that pride at Babel isn't just everyday arrogance. It's not just someone having an inflated ego about their book-making skills.
Right.
It is fundamentally rival worship.
Hang on, rival worship. That is a very heavy theological term. What does that actually mean for the people on the ground?
To put it simply, rival worship is when the creature attempts to occupy the creator's seat.
Wow.
Velazquez points out that this is the exact same logic used in the Garden of Eden, just scaled up to a societal level. In Genesis 3, the serpent's promise to Adam and Eve was, "You will be like God."
Right, the original temptation.
Here in Genesis 11, we are looking at the political and cultural architecture of that exact same promise. It is the human heart insisting, I will be the one to define what is good and evil. I will decide what counts as glory. I will be the architect of my own secure future.
So it's not just a bad building project. It is setting oneself up as a rival to God's authority.
Exactly.
And the absolute focal point of that rival worship is that phrase from the text, let us make a name for ourselves. Why is the concept of a name so central to this rebellion?
In the ancient Near Eastern context, and specifically within Scripture, naming is incredibly significant. It isn't just a label to get someone's attention.
Like a name tag?
Right. No, a name symbolizes identity, it signifies vocation, and it establishes authority. When God creates in Genesis, when he names the light day and the darkness night, he is exercising sovereign authority and assigning purpose to creation.
So when the builders at Babel say they want to make a name for themselves, they're actually trying to steal that authority.
Exactly. Velazquez argues that Babel is humanity's attempt to generate identity from below. It is a desperate collective grasp for self-authored significance rather than accepting the identity bestowed by the creator.
But the broader narrative of Genesis doesn't just leave us with that rebellion, right? The text immediately pivots to show how God counters this Babel impulse.
It does.
And it happens in the very next chapter.
Yeah.
Right after the scattering of the nations in Genesis 11, the camera zooms in on one single man in Genesis 12. God calls Abram.
Yes.
And what is the promise God makes to him? He says, I will make your name great.
And the contrast there is so intentional and absolute. Velazquez highlights this at a major theological pivot.
Yeah.
The builders at Babel say, let us make a name for ourselves through our own effort.
Right.
God responds by pulling Abram out of a pagan culture and saying, no, I will make a name for you by my grace.
That is such a huge shift.
It is. And we see this pattern throughout the entire biblical text. God constantly gives new names to his people. He renames Jacob to Israel. He promises believers a new name in the book of Revelation.
Okay, I see.
The point Velazquez is drawing out is that true identity in the biblical framework is granted by grace. It is a gift to be received, never a status to be manufactured by human effort.
So what does this all mean for us today? Because as I am listening to this breakdown of trying to make a name, I immediately think about our modern cultural obsession with personal branding.
Oh, it is everywhere.
We live in a society that is absolutely consumed with self-authored significance. We curate our online personas, we obsessively manage our networks, we humble brag on LinkedIn, we track our followers.
Constantly checking the metrics.
Right, all to literally make a name for ourselves.
The parallels are just striking. Velazquez might argue that the impulse is identical. It has just been digitized.
Digitize Babel.
Instead of baking bricks to build a ziggurat in the desert, We're using algorithms to build tiny individual ziggurats on our social media feeds.
And if you look at the psychological toll of that, it is utterly exhausting. Think about the chronic anxiety that comes from having to constantly maintain and defend your own significance.
It's a full-time job.
Because if you are the one who built your name, you are the only one who can protect it. If you manufacture your identity from below, you are only ever one bad post, one public failure, or one canceled contract away from your entire identity collapsing.
That is the fragile architecture of pride.
But the biblical concept that Velazquez is highlighting, which is resting in a God-given identity, completely flips that script. If your identity is a gift that is received rather than a status that is achieved, you don't have to frantically build it.
No, you don't.
And if you didn't build it, you don't have to spend all your energy frantically protecting it.
There is a quote directly from the source material that sums this up perfectly. It says, "Pride insists on self-naming. Grace grants God-given naming."
Grace grants God-given naming. Wow.
That is the relief that the text is offering. You are relieved of the burden of being the architect of your own worth.
Which opens up a much wider lens on this topic.
Yeah.
The source material emphasizes that Babel isn't just an isolated incident in the early chapters of Genesis.
Right, it ripples out.
Velazquez argues that the Babel story is actually the blueprint for the entire biblical meta-narrative. It establishes a cosmic contrast that runs all the way through the Old Testament and culminates in the New Testament.
If you trace the theme of the prideful ascent, the desire to build a tower to the heavens, you see it echoed continuously.
Where else does it show up?
Well, you see it in the prophetic books, like Isaiah 14 or Ezekiel 28, where the self-deification of kings leads directly to their downfall.
Okay, yeah.
You see a very literal parallel in Daniel 4 with King Nebuchadnezzar. He literally walks on the roof of his palace and boasts about the great Babylon he has built by his own mighty power for the glory of his majesty.
Sounds exactly like Genesis 11.
It is the exact same spirit, and instantly he is judged, his mind is altered, and he is humbled in a very Babel-like fashion.
And it goes all the way to the end of the Bible, too. In the book of Revelation, Babylon returns as the ultimate symbol of the world system's arrogance, its hoarding of wealth, its idolatry, and its inevitable final collapse.
But Velazquez points out that the most profound contrast to the Babel narrative isn't actually found in the judgment of Babylon. The ultimate contrast is found in the person of Jesus Christ.
How so?
The author draws our attention to Philippians chapter 2, which presents a dynamic that we might call the anti-tower.
The anti-tower. That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. Let's break down how that works mechanically.
Well, if the defining characteristic of Babel is humanity grasping at status, trying to aggressively ascend to the heavens to make themselves equal with God, the incarnation of Jesus is the exact and perfect inverse.
Okay, follow.
The text in Philippians 2 states that Christ, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped or exploited. Instead, he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant.
So the builders of Babel say, let us go up, let us build a tower, let us make a name. And Jesus says, I already have the highest name, but I will go down. I will descend into humility.
Precisely. The trajectory is entirely reversed. Jesus descends into the human experience, taking on the vulnerability that the Babel builders were so terrified of, and he is obedient to the point of death on a cross.
Wow.
In Velazquez's framework, the cross is the ultimate anti-tower, and the theological payoff in Philippians is that it is only after that profound descent, that ultimate display of humility, that God highly exalts him and bestows on him the name that is above every name.
It proves that in the divine economy, the way up is actually down.
Exactly.
But if Philippians 2 shows us the personal reversal of the Babel impulse in Christ, Velazquez also points out a massive societal reversal of the Babel curse. And this happens in the book of Acts at the event of Pentecost.
The thematic symmetry between Genesis 11 and Acts 2 is arguably one of the most masterful narrative threads in all of ancient literature.
We absolutely have to spend some time exploring this because the mechanics of what happens at Pentecost directly answer the trauma of Babel. Let's look at the historical context first.
Let's do it.
At Babel, you have humanity unified, but they are unified in pride and rebellion. As a divine restraint, God takes their one shared language and fractures it into many languages.
Right.
The result is total confusion, the inability to communicate, and the scattering of the nations.
But then you advance the timeline to Acts chapter 2. You have Jewish pilgrims gathered in Jerusalem from all over the known Roman Empire.
And they are all speaking different languages.
They speak dozens of different regional languages. The linguistic fracture of Babel is fully on display in the streets of Jerusalem.
But then the Holy Spirit descends on the early followers of Jesus, and suddenly these Galileans begin speaking, and the crowd is stunned because every single person from these disparate nations hears the message, the one truth of the gospel being spoken in their own native tongue.
It's
The
incredible.
linguistic barrier is miraculously breached.
Velazquez describes this as the redemptive gathering of what human pride had scattered. However, he highlights a crucial detail about how God orchestrates this new unity, and it is a detail that completely separates Pentecost from Babel.
Which is,
At Pentecost, God does not erase the linguistic diversity.
That is such a profound point. God doesn't reverse the Babel curse by reverting everyone back to a single monocultural language. He doesn't make everyone speak a heavenly version of Esperanto.
No, he sanctifies the diversity. He redeems the differences. The Holy Spirit communicates through the distinct languages of the Medes, the Parthians, the Egyptians, and the Romans.
It's all validated.
Yes, Velazquez argues that this demonstrates that the church doesn't achieve unity by suppressing cultural difference.
Because forced sameness was Babel's goal. Babel wanted uniformity without holiness. It was a totalitarian sameness.
Exactly. Pentecost, on the other hand, creates communion without uniformity. It takes beautifully diverse people with different cultures and languages and brings them under the singular lordship of Christ. It is unity through a shared center rather than unity through forced conformity.
So if Pentecost is the theological answer to Babel, and if Christ's humility is the ultimate anti-tower, how do we actually live this out in the real world?
That's the big question.
Because Velazquez makes it very clear that the Babel spirit isn't just a thing of the past. It is constantly rising up in our geopolitical societies, in our corporate institutions, and frankly, in our own daily motivations.
Right. To navigate that practically, the source material first clears up some very common modern misunderstandings about what the Babel story actually condemns.
Misunderstandings like what?
Because if you misdiagnose the problem, you will apply the wrong solution. For instance, some people read the story of Babel and conclude, well, God clearly hates human technology. He is against big cities, tall buildings, and human progress.
Right, they walk away with the takeaway that bricks are evil and cities are bad. Let's all go live in the woods.
But Velazquez argues that is a complete misreading of the text. Technology itself is not the issue. The capacity to bake bricks is a good thing.
Okay, then what is the issue?
The issue is the moral orientation of the technology. Human skill only becomes dangerous when it is leveraged to serve autonomous glory. It is never about the bricks. It is about the pride of the builder.
So it is the difference between building a hospital and building a monument to a dictator.
Yes, exactly.
The bricks are the same.
Yeah.
The moral orientation is entirely different. Another major misunderstanding Velazquez addresses is the idea that God is somehow against culture or diversity.
Which, as we saw with Pentecost, is demonstrably false in the biblical narrative. God is presented as the author of diversity. He's not against culture. He is against idolatrous culture.
Huge difference.
The problem at Babel wasn't that they were building a culture, but that they were attempting to detach their culture from its creator.
And there is the third misunderstanding that I think trips up a lot of well-meaning people. Velazquez clarifies that embracing the humility of Christ does not mean embracing passivity.
This is a vital distinction, especially for people working in leadership or creative fields. Humility is not the denial of your agency or the burying of your talents.
Right, you don't just sit there and do nothing.
Humility is your agency submitted to God. According to this framework, humanity is still called to build, to labor, to invent, and to organize.
We're still called to do all of that.
The defining question is not whether we should act, but whether we act as dependent servants or as autonomous rivals.
Which brings us to a section of Velazquez's work that I found incredibly challenging. He identifies what he calls the most insidious danger of all, which is religious babble.
This is where the theological analysis gets very, very uncomfortable because it turns the critique inward.
Because it's one thing to look at a secular empire or a greedy Wall Street corporation or a tyrannical government and point the finger and say, look at their babble. Look at their pride.
It's easy to do that.
It's a much more difficult thing to look inside your own religious institutions, your own nonprofits, or your own local church and see the exact same architecture being built.
Velazquez warns that religious leaders can very easily use spiritual work to secure their own identity. The danger is that you can build a massive tower of doctrinal correctness or ministry success or visible cultural influence and slap God's name on the front door while quietly, structurally, serving the glory of self.
The source notes actually contain a chilling phrase. It says, The most dangerous ministry temptation is to make a name for oneself in the name of making God known. That is a heavy quote.
How does that actually happen? How does a good mission drift into religious babble?
It happens because religious babble knows exactly how to hide. It hides behind orthodoxy, it hides behind excellence, production value, and measurable effectiveness.
So it looks successful on the outside?
Completely. But the structural direction remains identical to Genesis 11. It is upward self-construction. It begins to measure its worth by visibility, platform size, and influence, rather than by faithfulness and cruciform submission. It uses the language of the kingdom to basically build a personal fiefdom.
That is honestly terrifying because the outward language sounds correct, but the internal spiritual architecture is completely compromised.
So I have to ask you this, directly on behalf of our listener who is trying to process all of this. If this Babel impulse scales into our institutions, our academia, our churches, and even our families, showing up as this deep need to control outcomes or win every argument or leave a massive legacy, how do we practically wake up tomorrow morning and build a career or lead a team or create art without accidentally building a mini Babel?
Well, Velazquez provides a very clear, practical framework for this, centered on what he calls cruciform living.
Let's stop on that word for a second. Cruciform. That sounds like a seminary term. What does that actually look like in a boardroom or in a classroom or at a kitchen table?
Cruciform simply means cross-shaped. It means adopting the posture of Jesus in Philippians 2, the anti-tower posture we talked about.
Okay. Practically how?
Practically, it begins with a daily acknowledgement of dependence. The discipline of humility involves a very real, very honest recognition that you are a creature with limits, not a creator with infinite capacity.
So it starts with truthfulness about what you can and cannot control.
Yes. And from there, it shifts your motivation entirely. Cruciform living involves serving the work without demanding a specific return. You do the labor, you lead your team, you paint the canvas, you write the code, but you do it out of obedience and a desire to serve others, even if no one applauds you.
It is giving up the desperate need for the spotlight. It is releasing the need to control the narrative of your own legacy.
Velazquez outlines 3 specific habits that a person must actively resist to avoid building a personal Babel: self-protection at all costs, self-promotion at all costs, and self-definition apart from truth.
So, for example, if you are leading a team,
If you're leading a team, you lead as a facilitator, seeking the good of the team rather than demanding admiration as proof of your legitimacy. You don't try to unify people around your own personal ego. You center the work on shared objective truth. You begin to accept your life, your time, and your talents as gifts to be stewarded rather than conquests to be won.
it is shifting the internal monologue from, I must make myself great so I feel safe, to what Jesus actually said, which is, take up your cross and follow me. Velazquez uses a phrase that I absolutely love here, worshipful realism. We aren't God. We don't have all the answers. And most importantly, we don't bear the crushing burden of having to build our own eternal significance.
Because that significance is already secured. In the theological framework of the gospel, when you realize that your identity and your future are secured by grace, the desperate, frantic building just stops.
The panic goes away.
The panic subsides completely. You can finally just be a human being, limited, dependent, and deeply loved.
And that brings us to the core, final contrast that the story of Babel leaves us with. When you look at the broad sweep of history, every self-made tower eventually falls.
Every single one.
Every false city, no matter how impressive the engineering, how brilliant the architecture, or how wealthy the inhabitants, eventually collapses into ruin. Every self-made name eventually fades into obscurity. The kingdom of God, which is built on the bizarre foundation of humility and divine condescension, is presented as the only city that is going to last. So the ultimate question for all of us isn't whether we will build. Because as humans, as image bearers, we are inherently builders. We're going to build families, careers, art, and communities. The ultimate diagnostic question is whether we are building for our own name or whether we are building in service of something vastly larger than ourselves.
There is a final line from the author's analysis that serves as a perfect summary of that. He says, "Pride builds towers, humility builds lives."
Pride builds towers, humility builds lives.
Understanding that contrast changes the fundamental architecture of how we approach our daily work, our relationships, and our spirituality.
It really does. It reframes everything. And as we wrap up this deep dive today, I want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your day or your commute.
Absolutely.
We have spent all this time talking about how the tragedy of Babel was humanity trying to build their way up to God, using their most advanced technology and their unified power. And we explored how the triumph of the gospel is the exact opposite. God coming down to humanity in humility.
Right, the anti-tower.
So what does that mean for our modern, insatiable drive to engineer our own salvation today? Think about the headlines we see every week. Think about our current cultural obsession with artificial intelligence or biological enhancement, or Silicon Valley billionaires trying to cure death through technology. Are we in the 21st century still just making digital bricks?
Just a new kind of tower.
Are we still just trying to code our way to godhood so we don't have to face our own vulnerability? And here is the real question. If we ever do manage to reach the top of that incredible, shimmering technological tower, will we find it completely empty? Because if the story of the anti-tower is true, the divine isn't found at the peak of human achievement. He is actually found down in the dirt, serving the marginalized, washing feet, and inviting us to leave our towers and do the same.
That is a lot to think about.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of pride and the beauty of humility. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we will catch you next time.